Turning on your screen and learning that a prince, one of the most famous men on the planet, is flying back to the country of his birth completely alone, leaving his wife, his 7-year-old son, and his 5-year-old daughter thousands of miles away because he genuinely fears for their safety. And not in some abstract tabloid way, but because government security committees, legal appeals, and private risk assessments have all collided to create a standoff that is now dragged on for years. According to a report published by People on July 4th, 2026, that's exactly what is happening right now. And I have to tell you, when I first read the confirmation that Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet will not be setting foot in London next week, I felt this weird mixture of sadness and frustration. Because on one hand, you've got a father who desperately wants his family to see the country where he grew up, and on the other hand, you've got a security apparatus that seems to be stuck in a loop of reviews and legal rulings that haven't budged in nearly 7 years. And the real kicker is that the king himself offered them accommodations on a royal estate, but that offer didn't include the kind of round-the-clock protective bubble that Harry says is non-negotiable. Which raises the question that is going to sit in the back of your mind this entire report. What is really preventing a resolution here? And why does it feel like every step forward is met with 2 steps back into a legal and emotional maze that nobody seems able to solve? Now, I want to take you beyond the headlines because there are layers here that most outlets are completely glossing over, and I promise that by the time you reach the end of this deep dive, you'll understand not just the security chess match, but also the human cost that is often reduced to a 2-sentence update. So stick with me because what I'm about to unpack changes everything you thought you knew about this family's relationship with the United Kingdom. The core confirmation comes directly from People's sources, and it is strikingly specific. Prince Harry will travel to London solo for a series of charity engagements. And while no final decision has been made about whether Meghan and the family members might join him later outside the capital, the London leg is absolutely off the table for them. And according to the report, this reversal is directly tied to ongoing security concerns that Harry's camp has been vocal about for years. Concerns that I personally find hard to dismiss when you consider the documented threats and the sheer intensity of scrutiny that follows this family everywhere. You see, back on June 29th, a spokesperson for the Duke of Sussex told People that the entire trip was hanging on whether appropriate and proportionate protective security could be provided throughout the entirety of the visit, not just at a controlled estate, but everywhere they might go. And the king's offer to host them on a royal property sounds generous on the surface, but crumbles under scrutiny because the moment you step off that estate, you're back in the same vulnerability that Harry has described as unacceptable. And what makes this even tangler is that a review of Harry's security arrangements by RAVEC, that's the Executive Committee for the Protection of Royalty and Public Figures, had not yet concluded as of late June, which means a family's entire travel plan is being held hostage by a bureaucratic process that, according to Harry's representatives, hasn't conducted a full review of his case in almost 7 years. 7 years! Let that sink in. While the world changes and threats evolve, the mechanism that is supposed to reassess risk has been effectively frozen. Now, here's where I need to add a little of my own analysis, because I've been following this security saga since the moment Harry and Meghan stepped back in 2020. And I've got to say, if any other high-profile individual with documented threats and a global platform was told that their last formal risk review happened before their family members were even born, we'd be asking much harder questions about institutional inertia. And I don't think it's biased to point out that the pace of this review feels less like caution and more like avoidance. After Harry lost his legal appeal in May 2025 against the government's decision to remove automatic police protection, he told the BBC in an interview that still echoes in my mind. "I can't see a world in which I would be bringing my wife and family members back to the UK at this point." And then he added something that was genuinely heartbreaking. The things that they're going to miss is, well, everything. And he said he misses parts of the UK and finds it really quite sad that he won't be able to show his family members his homeland. And when you pair that raw emotion with the practical reality that his daughter Lilibet has only been on British soil once during the Platinum Jubilee in 2022 when she turned 1, you start to grasp the absurd tragedy of a situation where a grandfather is the King of England, and yet his youngest grandfamily members may grow up knowing the country only through photographs and stories. I'm not here to assign blame. I'm here to connect dots that often get lost in the noise. And right now, those dots paint a picture of a family that is actively exploring every available option, according to their own spokesperson, to make a visit happen safely. Yet each option seems to hit the same wall of incomplete security assurances. But let's pivot, because there's a personal dimension to this story that deserves more than a passing mention, and it involves two family members who are frequently discussed but rarely seen: Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor. I think it's important to humanize what their absence from London actually means. Archie was born in the UK in May 2019, and I still remember that photo call at Windsor Castle, just days old, wrapped up and presented to the world with so much hope. And he even joined his parents on a royal tour to South Africa, where he famously met Archbishop Desmond Tutu, his cheeks chubby, his curiosity palpable, a little boy who, for a brief moment, seemed destined to have a foot in both the old world and the new. But since the move to California, his public appearances have been intentionally limited, his face often obscured in the rare photos that are shared. Not because Harry and Meghan want to hide him, but because, according to a friend quoted by People, Harry has been reluctant to show his family members publicly out of a desire to protect their privacy and safety from potential threats. And that word threats isn't hyperbolic when you remember that this family has faced arrest-worthy intrusions, online vitriol, and constant paparazzi chases that would terrify any parent. Lilibet, born in Santa Barbara in June 2021, has an even more tenuous connection to her father's homeland. Her one visit in 2022 included a backyard birthday party at Frogmore Cottage, a moment that was both intimate and defiantly normal. Yet since then, she has only known Britain through video calls and bedtime stories. And I find it profoundly sad that a little girl named after the late Queen Elizabeth, with the middle name Diana, carries such a symbolic bridge between generations, but may not walk across it in person for years. When I read that Harry and Meghan had been vacationing in Europe with the family members ahead of the expected UK visit, I thought maybe this time it would be different. Maybe the logistics had been worked out behind closed doors. But the July 4 update basically pulled the rug out from under that hope. And now the question becomes whether the rest of the trip outside London will include them, or if this will be yet another solo mission for Harry while his family waits elsewhere. You might be asking why security is such an insurmountable hurdle when other royals manage just fine, and the answer lies in a unique set of circumstances that RAVEC itself seems ill-equipped to handle, because Harry's situation isn't like that of working royals who receive automatic taxpayer-funded protection. His status changed the moment he stepped back from senior duties, and while he has offered to pay for police protection himself, the courts have ruled that private funding cannot replace the powers and access of state security, creating a legal paradox where a man who can afford the best private security in the world is told that only government personnel can adequately protect him. But the government won't provide them unless a risk board decides he qualifies, and that board hasn't meaningfully reassessed his case since before the pandemic. I have to inject a bit of sarcasm here because the logic feels like a Monty Python sketch. You need protection to visit safely, but to get protection, you need a review. And to get a review, you need the board to convene. But the board hasn't convened in 7 years, and in the meantime, the threats don't pause. The family members grow up, and the grandfather gets older, and everyone just sort of shrugs and says it's complicated. I'm not mocking the seriousness of security work. I'm pointing out that the gap between stated process and actual action has become so wide that a family is making life-altering decisions based on the absence of paperwork. And that's a story worth telling with both empathy and a raised eyebrow. Now let's talk about what Harry is actually doing in the UK, because the narrative often gets simplified to he's coming back without context. And according to the same People report, his schedule is packed with charity engagements that speak to his long-standing commitments, events marking the one-year countdown to the 2027 Invictus Games in Birmingham, which is a massive milestone for the foundation he created, plus appearances supporting Wellchild and Scotty's Little Soldiers, organizations that focus on seriously ill family members and bereaved military families respectively. And I think it's impossible to ignore the emotional weight of him showing up for family who have lost parents while his own family members are half a world away from their father's heritage. This isn't just a prince attending ribbon-cutting ceremonies. It's a man confronting the very country that he feels has failed to protect his family, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, making speeches, all while that unspoken tension simmers beneath the surface. And I guarantee you that every journalist in the room will be reading his body language for signs of the private turmoil that the spokesperson has hinted at.
What I find particularly telling is the initial hope, according to sources, was for Archie and Lilibet to spend time with King Charles, and the idea of my family getting to know my dad shouldn't be a geopolitical negotiation. Yet here we are, with palace insiders and legal teams and risk assessments standing between a grandfather and his grandfamily members. And that's the kind of detail that makes even the most cynical observer pause, because regardless of what you think about Harry and Meghan's choices, the collateral impact on family bonds is genuinely sad. The report mentions that the king offered accommodations on a royal estate, and the immediate implication is that Sandringham or Balmoral might have been on the table, places with deep family history and sprawling grounds where family could run freely. But the catch was that security would not extend beyond the estate boundaries, meaning that any outing, any impromptu ice cream run or museum visit would be in a gray zone that Harry's team considers unacceptable. And honestly, I get it, because if you're
a parent and someone tells you you'll be safe inside these walls, but the moment you leave, you're on your own, you'd think twice too, especially when your family has been subjected to the kind of invasive scrutiny that this one has endured. Here's where I'm going to offer a perspective that you might not have considered. What if the real story isn't just about security, but about control and the lingering power dynamics of an institution that still hasn't fully adapted to a post-2020 reality? When Harry speaks about missing his homeland and wanting to show his family members the UK, he's talking about a version of Britain that exists beyond palace gates, the countryside, the history, the quirky little things that make a culture feel like home. And by denying the full security envelope, the system is effectively saying, you can visit, but only on our terms, which puts him in an impossible position: accept a constrained visit and potentially put your family at risk, or stay away and be painted as the one keeping the family from their heritage. I'm not saying there's some shadowy conspiracy. I'm saying that institutional inertia and unspoken expectations can be just as powerful as overt restrictions. And when you add the fact that Harry's last RAVEC review was nearly 7 years ago, the appearance of foot-dragging becomes a story in itself. And I think that's worth discussing openly without turning it into a partisan royalist versus Sussex supporter debate. Let's pull back the lens even wider, because the absence of Meghan from the London trip carries its own narrative weight. And while the stated reason is security, there's a subtext that isn't hard to read. Meghan's relationship with the British press and certain segments of the public remains fractious, and bringing her into central London would be like throwing a match into a barrel of fireworks, not because of anything she's done, but because the tabloid ecosystem has spent years building a caricature that guarantees every appearance becomes a feeding frenzy. And I suspect Harry knows that and is protecting her in more ways than one. That's not a political statement. It's an observation based on years of documented harassment and the very real toll that kind of environment takes on mental health. And I'd wager that part of the ongoing security concerns isn't just about physical threats, but about the psychological safety of a family that has been burned before. The People article makes it clear that Harry and Meghan were on a family vacation in Europe ahead of the expected UK visit, and I can't help but imagine what that vacation must have felt like. The family probably laughing and playing in some sunny Mediterranean spot while parents checked their phones for updates on a security review that might determine whether they could finally, after 4 years, show Archie the castle where he was presented to the world, and Lilibet the gardens named after her great-grandmother. There's a photo credit in the article from Meghan's Instagram, a holiday greeting that says, "Happy holidays from our family to yours," and it shows all 4 of them. And I think about how carefully curated those glimpses are, how each image is a tiny defiance against the narrative that they're hiding or ashamed, when in reality they're just desperately trying to carve out normalcy in a situation that is anything but normal. And for that, I have genuine respect, because the easy path would be to give up entirely and never mention the UK again, but Harry keeps showing up, keeps pushing for his family to have that connection, keeps knocking on a door that barely cracks open. Now, I want to dig into the legal timeline because it's crucial to understanding why this July 2026 moment isn't just another news cycle, but a pressure point that has been building for years. In 2020, when Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties, they lost automatic taxpayer-funded police protection, a decision that was upheld by the Home Office and then challenged by Harry in court. And in May 2025, after losing that appeal, he made the BBC comments that I referenced earlier. And I think it's worth quoting him again because the despair in his voice was palpable. "I can't see a world in which I would be bringing my wife and family members back to the UK at this point." That wasn't a negotiating tactic. That was a man who had exhausted legal avenues and was staring at a reality where his family's safety depended on a committee that apparently meets less frequently than some homeowners associations. And I mean that with zero disrespect to the serious work of RAVEC, but with a heavy dose of frustration at the pace of action. According to Harry's representatives, RAVEC's terms of reference call for a risk management board review at least once a year, yet his last review was conducted nearly 7 years ago. And if that fact is accurate, and it has not been contradicted by the government as far as I can tell, then something has gone fundamentally wrong in the process, and no amount of polite deflection can paper over that gap. I can already hear the counter-arguments. Maybe his risk level hasn't changed enough to warrant a new review. Maybe the board has been busy. Maybe there are classified reasons we don't know about. And I'm open to all of that. But from an outsider's perspective, when a man's profile has only increased, his family has grown, the online threats haven't exactly subsided, and the legal landscape has shifted, the idea that no formal reassessment is needed for 7 years strains credibility to the breaking point. This isn't about taking sides, it's about common sense, and common sense says you review security for high-profile individuals regularly, especially when family members are involved. And the failure to do so, whether intentional or not, has real-world consequences, like 2 family
not getting to see their dad's homeland and a grandfather potentially missing irreplaceable moments with grandfamily members he barely knows. Let me bring it back to the immediate, because the news itself is fresh and the ramifications are still unfolding. And while Harry will be in London fulfilling his charity commitments, the rest of the family remains in a state of limbo, with a decision yet to be made about joining him elsewhere in the UK outside the capital. And I find that phrase, outside the capital, fascinating, because it suggests that somewhere like Birmingham, where the Invictus Games countdown is happening, might be considered a different security calculus entirely, perhaps because the threat profile changes, perhaps because the royal estate accommodations aren't in play, or perhaps because the optics of a family reunion at a military-inspired event feel less charged than a London appearance. Whatever the reason, the door isn't completely closed, and that tiny sliver of possibility is what makes this story so emotionally gripping, because you're left wondering whether Archie and Lilibet will get to see a British beach or a countryside village, whether they'll hear English accents in person instead of on screens, whether they'll meet relatives whose faces they only know from photos. And all of that hinges on a committee and a legal framework that seems designed to move at glacial speed. One thing that jumped out at me from the People article is the mention of Harry's appearance at Scotty's Little Soldiers, a charity that supports family members who have lost a parent in the military. And I want to pause there because the parallel to his own family's loss is impossible to ignore. Harry lost his mother when he was just a boy, and that grief shaped his entire life. So when he shows up to comfort family who are navigating that same impossible absence while his own family members are prevented from fully experiencing his world, the emotional resonance is almost too much. And I have to imagine that part of him is thinking about what Diana would have wanted for Archie and Lilibet, the memories she would have helped create, the trips to the places he loved as a child. That's not tabloid speculation, that's basic empathy, and I think it's fair to say that this trip is going to be heavy for him in ways that the public won't see in the official photographs. The article also mentions that Meghan has been sharing family photos on her Instagram since rejoining the platform in early 2025, often with the family members' faces obscured, and I find that detail instructive because it tells you everything about the balance they're trying to strike. They want to share their joy, they want to connect with the public, but every post is a risk assessment in miniature, every image a potential flashpoint, and the fact that they still do it, still offer those curated glimpses, tells me that they haven't given up on the idea of a relationship with the public, even as the official relationship with the institution remains frosty. So, where does this leave us? As I record this, Prince Harry is preparing to head to London next week, alone, for a series of events that will honor the very values he holds dear: service, resilience, compassion, while his wife and family members remain in a holding pattern, their future travel plans as uncertain as the security review that might finally, perhaps, unlock a door that has been stuck for years. And the big question, the one I promised would linger, is whether this solo trip is a one-off or the new normal, and what the long-term cost will be to a family that has already paid such a high price for choosing a different path. I'll be watching closely, and I hope you will too, because this story isn't just about royalty. It's about what happens when bureaucracy and love collide. And right now, love is losing. And that's not a verdict, it's a call to pay attention.